Most of us are familiar with religious devotion in its gentler forms. The quiet church on Sunday morning, the candlelit vigil, the shared hymn or prayer. Even if you are not religious, the idea is familiar and almost comforting. People gather, they share a story about the world and their place in it, and they try, however imperfectly, to become better. But if you tilt that picture just slightly, it becomes less reassuring. The same longing for meaning, for certainty, for a group that will not let you go, can be turned in a very different direction. The hymn becomes a chant. The candlelit vigil becomes a locked compound. The pastor or teacher or guru stops simply interpreting the sacred text and starts deciding who you are allowed to marry, what you are allowed to eat, even whether you are allowed to live. At what point does a religious movement become a cult? Scholars argue about the definition, of course. Some prefer terms like high-control group or new religious movement to avoid moral judgment. But when we look at the most disturbing practices in cult history, a pattern emerges with unsettling clarity. It is less about what a group believes and more about what it does to the people who believe. Let us start with a story that many think they already know: Jonestown. In November of 1978, over 900 people died in a clearing hacked out of the Guyanese jungle. The settlement was called Jonestown, after its founder, an American preacher named Jim Jones, whose People's Temple had begun in the 1950s as a racially progressive church in Indiana and California. Early on, it resembled many other mid-century religious experiments: socialist rhetoric, communal living, a desire to break with what they saw as a corrupt and racist America. But here is where it gets complicated. Behind the scenes, Jones was already practicing the key moves of cult control. Members of the People's Temple were encouraged to cut off contact with skeptical family and friends. Personal possessions, homes, and savings were signed over to the church, often under emotional pressure or explicit threats. Sleep deprivation became routine. I've always found this detail particularly chilling. Exhausted people, working long days, then kept up late into the night for counseling sessions, public confessions, and lectures over the loudspeakers Jones had installed throughout the compound. Punishments were theatrical and cruel. Some members, including children, were put into coffin-shaped boxes in the ground, listening to others being berated above them. Others were beaten or humiliated in front of the group. Food was carefully rationed: rice for breakfast, rice water for lunch, rice and beans for dinner. Jones, by contrast, ate meat and richer dishes in private. The message was clear. He was no longer simply a pastor. He was the one who decided who ate, who slept, who was punished, and who was praised. And that is where things turned darker. By the mid-1970s, Jones was speaking more openly of revolutionary suicide as a political and spiritual act. Black members were repeatedly told that if they left Jonestown, American authorities would round them up into concentration camps. The arrival of United States Congressman Leo Ryan in November of 1978, investigating allegations of abuse, was treated by Jones as proof that the outside world was closing in. When some followers tried to leave with Ryan, Jones ordered an ambush at a nearby airstrip. Ryan and several others were murdered. Back at Jonestown, loudspeakers called the community to the open pavilion. Over 400 people, including many children, were injected with cyanide. The rest were ordered, and in many cases physically forced, to drink poison dissolved in a sweet fruit mix. Even here, in the moment of mass death, there was an eerie echo of earlier religious ritual. A community gathered, a shared cup, a promise that this act would lead them to a higher, purer existence. The horror of Jonestown is often treated as an aberration, a one-off explosion of madness in the jungle. But when you place it next to other groups, you begin to see how systematic these methods are. Take the Family International, better known by its earlier name, the Children of God. Founded in 1968 by David Berg, the group presented itself as a radical Christian movement focusing on love and communal living. By the 1970s, it had thousands of members and communes across several continents. On the surface, it looked like a particularly earnest countercultural church. But within the group, Berg's teachings about love took on a very different meaning. Through illustrated letters known as Mo letters, he promoted a theology in which sexuality became the primary way to express divine love. There is nothing new about religious leaders preaching about sex, of course. The disturbing twist here was the way Berg erased the usual moral and legal boundaries. Adult members were encouraged, indeed commanded, to engage in sexual activity with children, sometimes as young as 12, presented as sharing God's love. Sex between adults and minors was defended as spiritually uplifting. Contraception was forbidden on religious grounds, so children were born into the group in large numbers. Into a world where, as one survivor put it, there were no bedtime stories, only endless tales of the violent end of the world and the special mission they had been given. In 1976, Berg introduced flirty fishing, in which women were instructed to seduce men outside the group in order to recruit them or secure financial support. By his own boastful reports, this tactic brought in tens of thousands of new contacts. The language used was again religious. Women were to be fishers of men, using their bodies as bait in a holy cause. What is striking is how the spiritual vocabulary hid a kind of industrial-scale exploitation. Members labored to finance Berg's hidden lifestyle while their children were sexualized and often abused. A British court, after examining evidence in the 1990s, described the group bluntly as an authoritarian cult engaged in systematic physical and sexual abuse of children. If Jonestown shows us what happens when a leader gains the power of life and death, the Children of God illustrates how religious language can be used to rewrite the most basic moral intuitions from the ground up. Now, this may sound like the end of the story, a grim progression from idealism to abuse to collapse. But the pattern continued, often in unexpected 4Ms. In 1974, in the United States, Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles founded a small group that would come to be known as Heaven's Gate. Their theology was an unusual mixture of Christian apocalyptic expectation, New Age spirituality, and science fiction. Earth, they taught, was a kind of garden being recycled. The faithful would shed their human bodies and ascend to a higher, physically real level of existence aboard a craft from another world. In contrast to the sexual excess of the Children of God, Applewhite moved in the opposite direction. Members were expected to live almost like monastics, celibate, uniformed, with identical haircuts, sharing everything. Personal identities were to be shed like old skins. Some male members, following Applewhite's example, underwent surgical castration. On the surface, this looks like a simple reversal, where one group sacralized sex, another sacralized its total rejection. Underneath, however, the structure is familiar. Bodily autonomy is surrendered. The leader's interpretation of the sacred story becomes the only one that matters. In March of 1997, as Comet Hale-Bopp passed close to Earth, 39 members of Heaven's Gate prepared to exit. They recorded farewell statements. They dressed in identical black clothing and brand-name athletic shoes, a tidy uniform for transcendence. One by one, they ingested a mixture of phenobarbital and alcohol, lay down on neatly made bunk beds, and placed purple shrouds over their bodies. They believed, quite literally, that they were going home. Former members have spoken of why this strange vision was so persuasive. Many had felt, in their words, like misfit toys all their lives. Heaven's Gate offered a script, a family, a sense that every hardship was part of a cosmic plan. Again, we see the core exchange. Give up autonomy, receive meaning and belonging. But if Heaven's Gate withdrew from the world, some groups chose a more direct engagement with it. In 1987, in Japan, Shoko Asahara founded Aum Shinrikyo, a movement combining elements of Buddhism, Hinduism, Christian apocalyptic imagery, and a heavy dose of science fiction. The group attracted highly educated followers, including scientists and engineers, with promises of spiritual enlightenment and survival in an impending world war. Asahara taught that global destruction was inevitable, that humanity was soaked in bad karma, and that hastening this destruction could be a form of spiritual responsibility. It is an unsettling move. From avoiding the end times to volunteering for a role in them. In March of 1995, 5 members of Aum boarded trains on the Tokyo subway during morning rush hour, carrying plastic bags of liquid sarin nerve agent wrapped in newspaper. At pre-arranged stops, they punctured the bags with the sharpened tips of umbrellas and stepped off the trains. Commuters began coughing, then choking, then collapsing. 13 people were killed. Over 5,000 were injured. Train platforms were littered with the belongings of those who fled. Briefcases, shoes, folded newspapers, mute witnesses to an invisible terror. Investigations later revealed that this was not a sudden improvisation. Aum had already tested sarin in the town of Matsumoto the previous year, killing 8 and injuring hundreds. The group had invested millions of dollars in chemical weapon facilities, staffed by trained chemists and engineers. Here again, religious devotion did not merely coexist with modern technology. It harnessed it in the service of a leader's violent prophecy. And while Aum's crimes were prosecuted, its existence forces an uncomfortable question. How do modern states handle groups that cloak terrorism in religious vocabulary, and that recruit not the naive and uneducated, but the scientifically trained? If we move back to the United States in the early 1990s, we encounter another group whose story has been told and retold, sometimes with more heat than light. The Branch Davidians, led by David Koresh near Waco, Texas. The Branch Davidians began as an offshoot of the Seventh-day Adventist Church in the 1930s. But by the time Koresh rose to leadership, their theology had become intensely focused on the Book of Revelation and the imminent end of the world. Koresh claimed the right to interpret the 7 seals and identified himself with the Lamb of God in a disturbingly literal way. Internal rules tightened. Married couples were instructed to abstain from sex. Koresh himself took multiple spiritual wives, including girls as young as 11. In his reading, the prophet's prerogative extended into every bedroom. Weapons were stockpiled. Children were raised in an environment where obedience to Koresh's voice was treated as obedience to God. In February of 1993, United States federal agents attempted to search the Mount Carmel compound for illegal weapons. A gun battle erupted. For 51 days, the siege continued, with negotiators, television cameras, and tanks shadowing a theological drama that had until then unfolded largely in Bible studies and private revelations. On April 19th, tear gas was inserted into the buildings. Fires broke out. How they started remains hotly debated, and 76 people died inside, including Koresh and 25 children. The Waco siege is now a touchstone in discussions of religious freedom, state power, and law enforcement strategy. But at its core lies the same dynamic: a leader whose word is law, followers cut off from outside influence, and a sacred story interpreted in such a way that any compromise becomes betrayal. These dramatic cases, Jonestown, the Children of God, Heaven's Gate, Aum Shinrikyo, the Branch Davidians, are the ones that make it into documentaries and history books. They end with mass death or dramatic raids with court cases and international headlines. Yet if we step back, we find that the underlying practices they used are not limited to such spectacular tragedies, and they have not vanished into the past. Recent inquiries in places like the Australian state of Victoria, for example, have examined contemporary high-control religious groups that most people have never heard of. The Geelong Revival Centre, City Builders Church, and others. Survivors there describe quieter but chillingly familiar forms of control. Leaders who discourage medical treatment in favour of prayer, who normalise corporal punishment of children, who arrange marriages, and who attempt to convert gay members through spiritual coercion. A survey of former members of cult-like groups in that region found that more than 4 out of 5 reported intense psychological manipulation. A similar proportion said they had been pressured to stay and cut off from friends and family. Around 3/4 described emotional abuse. Over half had been financially controlled or exploited. Nearly 1/3 reported sexual abuse. These numbers echo in statistical form what we see in the more notorious historical cases. Isolation, control, exploitation. justified in the name of faith, healing, or community. Historically, groups like Synanon in mid-20th century America show us the same elements in a different key. Beginning as a drug rehabilitation program in the late 1950s, Synanon experimented with intense group therapy sessions called The Game, in which members were verbally attacked for hours in the name of honesty. By the 1970s, the group's charismatic founder, Chuck Dederick, had introduced compulsory vasectomies for men and abortions for women, as well as forced separation of children from their parents. What started as a therapeutic community slid, almost step by step, into a closed authoritarian system. And if we wish to move beyond Western examples, we find numerous other groups, from Roche Thériault's Ant Hill Kids in Canada, with their horrific physical mutilations and medical treatments, to smaller movements in Latin America, Europe, and Asia, where devotion is slowly retooled into obedience and obedience into vulnerability. So what then are the most disturbing cult practices in history? The mass suicides and chemical attacks certainly qualify. The systematic sexual abuse of children, justified with theological creativity, is almost impossible to contemplate. But beneath these, I would argue, lies something subtler and in some ways more unsettling: the carefully engineered breaking and remaking of a person. The methods are surprisingly consistent. First, isolation, physical removal to a compound in Guyana, or social removal by cutting ties to worldly friends and family. Second, information control. Only the leader or approved texts are trusted. Media, books, and outside clergy are dismissed as corrupt. Third, exhaustion, sleep deprivation, endless meetings, long days of labor, leaving little time to reflect or doubt. Fourth, constant confession and humiliation. Members are encouraged to expose their weaknesses, which then become tools for control. And finally, a narrative in which any doubt, any desire to leave, is not simply a personal choice, but a cosmic betrayal with eternal consequences. Once these are in place, almost any practice can be woven in. Forced marriages become part of God's plan. Beatings are framed as discipline from a loving father. Castration is a path to purity. Poisoned fruit drink is the last test of faith. It is tempting to view all of this from a safe distance, as if we ourselves could never be vulnerable to such systems. Yet the people who joined these groups were usually not fools. Many were idealists or spiritual seekers or simply lonely. Others were born inside and never knew another world. The line between healthy devotion and destructive control is not drawn by belief alone, but by power. Who holds it, how they use it, and what happens when someone says no. In recent years, conferences like Decult in New Zealand have begun bringing survivors, scholars, and clinicians together to discuss these issues in a more systematic way. Lawmakers in several countries are debating whether existing laws on assault, fraud, and coercive control are enough, or whether new frameworks are needed to recognize the specific harms that can occur under religious or spiritual cover. It is, in a sense, a very modern version of an old question. How do we respect sincere belief while protecting people from those who would weaponize it? As we draw to a close, it is worth returning to where we began. The ordinary, almost banal act of gathering around a story. Humans have always sought physical anchors for their beliefs: relics, sacred texts, shared meals, ritual acts repeated week after week. These are not in themselves sinister. They give shape to time, comfort in grief, identity in a bewildering world. What these dark histories show us is how fragile that line can be. The same hunger that leads one person to kneel quietly in a church can lead another to board a plane to Guyana or to hand over their child to a leader who promises salvation. The need is the same: to belong, to be guided, to feel that one's suffering and sacrifice are part of something larger and more meaningful than a single life. To my mind, the most unsettling thing is not that such groups exist, but that they are so good at presenting themselves as the answer to very understandable human questions. They offer certainty in place of doubt, community in place of isolation, clarity in place of the messy compromise of ordinary life. The price, though, is paid in autonomy, in bodily safety, in the quiet ability to say no and have that word respected. Perhaps the lesson is not to distrust every community or every conviction, but to watch carefully how power moves within them. Who may question and who may not? Who is allowed to leave and what happens if they try? Which practices are open to discussion and which are wrapped in the language of the sacred to place them beyond critique? In the end, the most disturbing cult practices are a distorted mirror held up to very human desires. By studying them, calmly, critically, and with more curiosity than condemnation, we may learn something not only about the worst that can happen when devotion turns to domination, but also about how to protect the more fragile, more hopeful forms of faith and belonging that most of us still, in one way or another, seek. Thank you for spending this time walking through these difficult histories. Wherever you find your own sources of meaning, I hope they remain places where questions are welcomed, boundaries are honored, and no one has to surrender their life or their mind to prove their belief.